The room was tense before the first word was spoken. Marble walls, polished oak desks, the hum of cameras capturing every angle. It all felt like the stage of a trial, where truth itself was the defendant. At the center sat Steve Bannon, his jaw set, eyes scanning the chamber with the swagger of a man who believed he'd outlast every storm. He leaned back, arms folded, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Across the dais, Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm, deliberate tone carried more power than any shouted insult ever could. "Mr. Bannon," she began, pausing just long enough to tighten every throat in the room. "The problem isn't just your rhetoric. It's the millions flowing through your so-called grassroots organizations that the American people never got to see." Gasps cracked the silence. Staffers froze mid-note. The words hung in the air, like a verdict. For the first time that morning, the smug mask on Bannon's face flickered. His eyes darted down, then back up, as if searching for an escape. The cameras caught it, and within seconds, the moment was already immortalized. A split-second glimpse of vulnerability in a man who built his career on projecting untouchable strength. Bannon coughed, straightened, and forced out a smirk. "Congresswoman," he said, voice sharp but trembling at the edges. "You're chasing shadows. You don't have a clue what you're talking about." But the tremor was there. Everyone could hear it. Crockett didn't respond right away. She let the silence work for her, staring him down with the quiet certainty of someone holding more than just words. Finally, she slid a thick folder across the desk toward the clerk. The slap of paper against wood was louder than any gavel. The audience shifted. This wasn't theater anymore. It was evidence, and Bannon knew it. For years, he had thrived in shadows, spinning influence behind closed doors, daring anyone to peel back the curtain. Now, in this chamber, the curtain had been pulled. What Crockett revealed next wouldn't just rattle Bannon. It would ripple far beyond these walls, igniting a conversation about money, power, and democracy itself. And the world was about to see just how fragile his empire really was. To understand why that single exchange sent shockwaves through the chamber, you have to know who sat on opposite sides of the table. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision of two worldviews, two Americas. Steve Bannon, the self-styled disruptor, has always thrived in the shadows. He built his reputation on turning division into power, transforming fear into fundraising, and cloaking political movements in the language of the people while quietly funneling money from places most citizens will never see. To his followers, he is a strategist, a prophet even. To his critics, he is a manipulator, hiding corruption behind a curtain of slogans and bluster. But that curtain was beginning to fray. For years, whispers had followed him. Shell corporations, nonprofits with no transparency, millions of dollars shuttled through a maze of paperwork designed to keep the public in the dark. In politics, money is power, and dark money is the purest form of it, invisible, untraceable, and unaccountable. When it moves, it leaves no fingerprints, but its weight can tip elections, sway policies, and drown out the voices of everyday people. That's what Jasmine Crockett walked into this hearing determined to confront. She didn't come from a dynasty of donors or a pipeline of backroom power brokers. Her rise was born of something different: long nights in courtrooms fighting for justice, years of knocking doors in communities that rarely got attention, a career built on the conviction that democracy works only when sunlight floods every corner. Crockett knew the danger of unchecked power. She had seen how quickly silence can smother opportunity, how often wealth is weaponized against those who have none. So when she spoke Bannon's name in that chamber, she wasn't just questioning a political figure. She was calling out a system that ordinary Americans had been told was too complicated, too untouchable, too permanent to change. She was dragging the conversation into the open, where cameras would beam it to every household, where voters could see exactly what was at stake. And the stakes were enormous. If Crockett could link Bannon to the dark money web circling American politics, it wouldn't just bruise his reputation. It could unravel the myth of his invincibility. It could show the country that the emperor of influence had been standing on nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Bannon, the architect of shadows, smirking behind carefully built walls of secrecy. Crockett, the challenger, armed not with wealth or whisper networks, but with relentless preparation and the courage to say what others were too cautious to voice. One man represented the machinery of hidden power. One woman stood as its mirror, determined to show the public what it really looked like. That's why the silence after her accusation was so heavy. It wasn't just about him, it was about whether democracy still had defenders bold enough to confront money in the dark. Every spectator in that room could feel it. Something bigger than politics was unfolding. And as Crockett's hand rested on that thick folder of documents, it became clear this wasn't a warning. It was the opening salvo of a battle that could expose the hidden arteries of American power itself. What she was about to lay out would not just challenge Steve Bannon's credibility, it would reveal a network of influence so sprawling, so secretive, that denying it would no longer be an option. And once those pages began to turn, there would be no going back. For years, Steve Bannon built his reputation on being untouchable. He wore controversy like armor, brushing off indictments, investigations, and exposés with a grin that said, "You can't pin me down." To his loyalists, he was the mastermind who could outwit any opponent. But beneath that image lay a financial web so intricate, so deliberately concealed, that pulling on a single thread threatened to unravel the entire design. And Jasmine Crockett had just tugged at the first one. Bannon's dark money empire didn't look like corruption at first glance. That was the genius of it. On paper, it was a patchwork of nonprofits, advocacy groups, and fundraising platforms. Each one claimed to represent grassroots voices, patriotic causes, or urgent calls to defend American values. But scratch the surface and the story shifted. The donors were hidden, the expenditures were vague. Money entered these organizations like water poured into a labyrinth of pipes, emerging somewhere else in some other form, almost impossible to trace. Take, for example, one of Bannon's favorite tactics, the use of social welfare nonprofits, organizations classified under 501c4 of the tax code. These groups could raise unlimited funds, spend heavily on politics, and, most importantly, keep their donors secret. Millions could pour in from wealthy elites or corporate giants, and the public would never know who was buying influence. Under Bannon's guidance, these groups multiplied. Some funneled cash into election ads thinly disguised as issue advocacy. Others bankrolled rallies and movements designed to look spontaneous but were anything but. And then there were the shell companies. Entities registered under vague names, sometimes overseas, sometimes through proxies, all designed to obscure where the money came from and where it went. Wire transfers bounced across borders. Invoices were padded, contracts shuffled between subsidiaries. Each layer blurred the trail, each transaction making the truth harder to follow. For watchdogs and journalists, it was like chasing smoke. But Crockett's team had studied the patterns. They noticed the timing, funds moving in just before major political events, only to disappear into a haze of consulting fees and operational costs. They noticed the repetition, the same names, the same addresses, tied to different organizations across multiple states. They noticed the deception, grassroots campaigns that weren't grassroots at all, but funded by the same shadowy networks. And behind it all, Bannon loomed like a puppeteer. He didn't need to sign every check or draft every filing. His influence was more subtle: strategy sessions, phone calls, quiet nods in private meetings. His fingerprints were not always visible, but his blueprint was unmistakable. To the American public, this was more than financial trickery. It was a direct assault on democracy. Because every hidden dollar meant a voice silenced. Every shadowy donation drowned out the concerns of voters who couldn't compete with billionaire-backed influence. Every shell company widened the gap between the powerful and the people they claimed to serve. Crockett understood that exposing this wasn't just about Steve Bannon. It was about forcing the country to look at the machine he represented, a machine that thrived on secrecy, that weaponized complexity, that convinced citizens their suspicions were paranoia while quietly reshaping their political reality. And so, in that chamber, her accusation was more than a jab at Bannon's ego. It was a spotlight slicing through the dark. She knew he would sneer, deflect, call her uninformed. But for the first time, the smug grin didn't land. Because Bannon knew what lay in that folder. He knew the paper trail was longer than he ever intended anyone to see. The villain in this story wasn't just a man. It was a system built to hide men like him. And Crockett was about to make that system visible. The chamber buzzed with anticipation. Allies braced for confrontation. Critics leaned forward, eager to see if Crockett could back up her claim. Bannon's smirk returned, thinner this time, as if to reassure himself more than anyone else. But the cracks were showing. Because when the first document slid into the record, it wasn't speculation anymore. It was evidence. And that evidence was about to change everything. Long before she sat in that chamber staring down Steve Bannon, Jasmine Crockett learned what it meant to fight uphill battles with nothing but grit and conviction. Her story didn't begin in marble halls or political backrooms. It began in communities where every promise mattered, where justice was not a lofty word but a daily necessity. Born and raised in Texas, Crockett grew up in a world that didn't hand victories out freely. She saw neighbors work themselves to the bone only to be ignored by the very systems that claimed to represent them. She saw classrooms underfunded, courtrooms tilted against the poor, and policies written for the powerful while everyday families struggled to breathe. Those early years gave her something money could never buy: a sense of responsibility, a duty to fight not for herself, but for those who rarely had anyone in their corner. Law became her weapon. As a civil rights attorney, Crockett wasn't chasing prestige, she was chasing fairness. Case after case, she faced off against systems stacked in favor of wealth and privilege. Landlords who preyed on tenants, employers who exploited workers, institutions that treated people as statistics rather than human beings. Each time she stepped into court, she carried the weight of those who couldn't afford their own defense. And each time she walked out, win or lose, she carried lessons about resilience, about strategy, about the kind of endurance it would one day take to stand before men like Bannon. Her transition into politics wasn't inevitable, it was necessary. Crockett realized that fighting one case at a time wasn't enough if the laws themselves were tilted toward the powerful, so she ran for office. Against the odds, against moneyed opponents, she leaned on the same people she had defended for years. Grassroots donors, volunteers who knew her face, who trusted her to keep her word. She didn't enter Washington polished and insulated. She entered scarred by struggle, sharpened by real battles that left no room for illusions. That's what made her dangerous to men like Bannon. She wasn't playing by their script. She didn't need their approval, their networks, their donor class. Her legitimacy didn't come from hidden checks. It came from communities that knew exactly who she was and why she fought. In Washington, her presence was a reminder that politics could still belong to people who weren't supposed to make it this far. Her voice carried the cadence of a lawyer who had faced down arrogant prosecutors. Her questions bore the weight of someone who had studied corruption not in theory, but in practice. And her patience, her ability to sit through bluster, to let silence work in her favor, came from years of watching powerful men unravel when confronted with the truth. By the time she walked into that hearing with Bannon, she was no stranger to being underestimated. She had heard the whispers, too new, too bold, too unpolished. But every doubt only sharpened her edge, because Crockett knew something Bannon never could. When your power comes from the people, not the shadows, you don't need to hide. That was her shield, her armor, her secret weapon. While Bannon sat cloaked in wealth and whispers, she walked in with the raw authority of lived struggle. And when she looked at him across the chamber, she didn't see an untouchable giant. She saw another man trying to bluff his way through accountability. It's why her voice carried such weight when she spoke. Every syllable wasn't just hers. It belonged to every tenant she defended, every worker she represented, every neighbor who told her they felt invisible. Her confrontation with Bannon wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was the culmination of years preparing for a fight exactly like this. She knew the stakes, she knew the danger, but she also knew that silence was no option. The system Bannon represented thrived on silence, and Crockett had spent her life breaking silences. So when she slid that folder across the table, it wasn't just a politician making a point. It was the daughter of Texas, the civil rights attorney, the grassroots fighter, the congresswoman, all of them standing at once, saying to power, "We see you, we are not afraid of you, and we are ready to expose you." The room may not have realized it yet, but Bannon did. His smirk was thinner, his eyes sharper, his posture just a little less certain. He knew he wasn't facing a rookie. He was facing a woman who had been preparing her whole life for this moment. And what she was about to unleash would turn a tense exchange into a reckoning. The hearing room was no longer a quiet chamber of record-keeping and protocol. It had become an arena. Every eye flickered between Bannon and Crockett, as if the very oxygen in the room carried the weight of their clash. What began as simple questioning had grown into something far sharper, far more combustible. Bannon leaned back, arms folded, his grin widening with every minute. He treated the proceedings like theater, mocking the rules, smirking at interruptions, tossing out evasive half-answers laced with arrogance. Each response dripped with the same contempt he had carried into courtrooms, studios, and boardrooms before. To him, it was all a game. Delay, deflect, dominate. But Crockett wasn't playing his game. She pressed harder, her questions cutting with precision, never letting him wiggle free. She raised documents, timelines, contradictions, each one tightening the trap. With every exchange, the contrast sharpened. Bannon, dismissive and flippant. Crockett, steady and relentless. And then came the sparks. At one point, Bannon interrupted with a mocking laugh, his voice carrying across the room.
Congresswomen, maybe if you'd done your homework, you'd understand how politics actually works. It was the kind of jab designed to belittle, to remind the world that he had been pulling strings long before she arrived. His allies in the corner chuckled, feeding his arrogance. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her silence cut deeper than any interruption. She let her laughter echo, let the smugness swell, and then she struck, her voice calm but razor-edged. Mr. Bannon, the difference between us is simple. You manipulate democracy for profit. I defend it for people. The room stirred. Staffers shifted. Pens paused. For a fleeting moment, the laughter stopped.
Bannon's grin faltered, then returned with more force, his voice rising now, less playful, more defensive. He accused her of grandstanding, of not understanding the stakes, of chasing sound bites for television. But every word he spit only made him sound smaller, more desperate. Crockett leaned in, never raising her tone, never losing her composure. If truth sounds like a soundbite to you, Mr. Bannon, maybe that says more about your relationship with it than mine. It was no longer just testimony, it was a duel, his bluster against her discipline, his noise against her clarity. Each exchange built pressure, like a storm tightening its grip on the sky. The audience watching online began clipping, quoting, sharing. The hashtag war was already beginning to ignite beyond those walls. And still, Crockett pressed forward. She refused to let him dictate tempo or tone. Each pause she gave him felt like a trap, each stare a reminder that she wasn't intimidated. She wasn't there for performance, she was there for accountability. By now, the committee chair had to gavel the room twice to restore order. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Bannon's allies squirmed, trying to decide whether his swagger still looked like strength or whether it had started to look like fear disguised as bravado. Because the truth was visible to everyone, Bannon had expected an easy sparring partner, someone he could ridicule into silence. Instead, he had met a wall of calm conviction, a mirror reflecting his own arrogance back at him. And Crockett wasn't finished. She had been building towards something bigger, something undeniable. This wasn't just escalation, it was setup. She was preparing to drop the kind of counterstrike that would not only silence the laughter in the room, but ripple far beyond it. The chamber leaned in without even realizing it. What came next would not just shake Bannon's confidence, it would leave a mark on history. For nearly an hour, Steve Bannon had strutted and smirked, spinning evasions like a man convinced of his own invincibility. He had chuckled through questions, interrupted with condescension, and tried to turn the committee chamber into his own stage. But as Jasmine Crockett prepared to deliver her counterattack, a different kind of silence settled over the room, tense, expectant, electric. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her tone measured, almost surgical. Mr. Bannon, let's take a look at the timeline, shall we? She slid a folder across the table, the pages inside brimming with receipts, emails, and documented contradictions. He glanced at it, then smirked, unwilling to give ground. But Crockett didn't need his acknowledgement. She turned to the committee, her voice steady, the cadence deliberate. For weeks, we've heard Mr. Bannon posture about loyalty to this country. Yet here we have financial records showing consulting fees tied to shadowy foreign entities, money flowing not towards serving the American people, but towards serving himself. The words landed like blows. Bannon shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing. He tried to cut her off. That's a mischaracterization. But she overrode him without raising her volume, the authority in her tone drowning out his bluster. Sir, this isn't a mischaracterization. These are your documents, your signatures, your deals. Gasps rippled quietly through the staffers in the back row. The stenographer's fingers flew faster across the keys. Reporters leaned forward, sensing history crystallizing before them. Crockett pressed on, each point sharper than the last. You parade yourself as a defender of America's values, yet the record shows you profited off undermining them. You claim loyalty to democracy, yet your communications reveal contempt for the very process you pretend to protect. You accuse others of corruption, while your empire was built on backroom dealings and betrayal. Bannon's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. He threw up his hands, his voice booming across the chamber. This is nothing but a witch hunt. You don't know what you're talking about. His outburst was loud, but it lacked precision. It was sound without substance, anger without armor. Crockett let the eruption linger, then delivered the line that cut through the noise. Mr. Bannon, the difference between you and me is that I serve people who trusted me with nothing but their hope. You serve yourself, and the more you shout, the clearer that becomes to everyone watching.
The committee chair banged the gavel for order, but the damage was already done. Bannon's swagger had cracked. His interruptions sounded shrill. His bravado looked brittle. The longer he spoke, the smaller he appeared, as if every word he uttered eroded the myth of invulnerability he had built around himself. And Crockett wasn't done. She flipped to another page. Here's an email where you describe ordinary Americans as pawns. Here's a contract funneled through shell companies. Here's correspondence where you openly strategize about defying Congress, not to protect principles, but to protect your wallet. Every revelation was a hammer strike.
Every sentence layered with precision. She wasn't just exposing contradictions, she was dismantling the very image he had spent years cultivating. Bannon leaned forward now, jabbing a finger, trying to reassert dominance. You don't understand strategy. You've been here 5 minutes and think you can lecture me on politics? His voice cracked under the weight of his fury. Crockett tilted her head, almost pitying him. No, Mr. Bannon, I don't need to understand your strategy. I understand the truth, and the truth is stronger than any performance. The audience outside the chamber, watching live streams, reading tweets, erupted. Clips of the exchange were already viral. Hashtags lit up. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Bannon exposed. Commentators posted side-by-side images. Bannon red-faced and yelling, Crockett poised and unshaken. The contrast was undeniable. Inside the room, her words had shifted the energy. The committee members who had been passive now leaned in. Allies nodded. Even opponents looked uneasy, sensing the tide turning. And then came the mic drop moment. Crockett paused, let the silence stretch, and delivered her closing strike. Mr. Bannon, history won't remember the excuses you gave today. It will remember that when you had the chance to stand on the side of democracy, you chose profit. And when you tried to hide behind arrogance, the truth caught up with you. The chamber fell still. No one laughed now. No one smirked. Bannon sat frozen, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. For a man who prided himself on being untouchable, on bending narratives to his will, the moment was devastating. He had been cornered not by spectacle, but by clarity, by a congresswoman who represented the very values he dismissed. The gavel struck again. The chair called for a recess, but the damage was irreversible. As Crockett gathered her papers, the cameras zoomed in, capturing the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her lips. Not gloating, not triumphant, but resolute. She had done what few dared, strip power from a man who thrived on intimidation and return it to the people watching. And outside those walls, the ripple had only begun. The hearing was no longer a simple inquiry. It was a cultural moment, a showdown that would ignite conversations in classrooms, living rooms, and boardrooms alike. Bannon had walked in believing he could dominate the narrative, but Crockett had just reminded the nation and the world that dignity could still defeat arrogance. And as the recess bells rang, one question lingered in the air. If this was the strike, what would the aftershocks look like? The committee chamber emptied into a frenzy, but the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Steve Bannon didn't stay within those four walls. It detonated across the country like a cultural earthquake. Within minutes, social media caught fire. Clips of Crockett's calm dismantling of Bannon exploded across timelines. On Twitter, hashtags surged to the top. Hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag Bannon exposed, hashtag truth over arrogance. TikTok users stitched her mic drop line into viral edits, layering cinematic music over her words. Captions flashing across the screen. History won't remember your excuses. Instagram Reels turned her stare down into a symbol of resilience, the kind of moment that transcended politics and became personal. Everywhere, the contrast was undeniable. A woman of conviction, standing steady, versus a man unraveling under the weight of his own arrogance. Commentators, comedians, and everyday citizens latched onto that imagery. Memes sprouted overnight. Bannon's flushed, shouting face side by side with Crockett's unshaken poise. Some labeled him noise, her clarity. Others used split screens. This is what power looks like, and this is what truth looks like. Cable news seized the footage. Analysts replayed the exchange frame by frame, noting how Crockett never raised her voice, how she wielded documents like weapons, how Bannon's interruptions revealed panic more than control. Pundits who had once dismissed her as a political newcomer were suddenly reevaluating. Crockett has just put herself on the national map. This wasn't just a hearing. This was a declaration. And beyond the media, ordinary people felt the resonance. Teachers in classrooms replayed the clip as an example of composure under fire. Activists cited it as proof that grassroots leaders could stand up to entrenched power. Immigrant families shared it in group chats, seeing in her defiance a reflection of their own struggles for dignity in a country that too often questioned their belonging. Even celebrities weighed in. A-list actors retweeted the clip with single-word captions, Queen. Musicians dropped emojis of fire and clapping hands. Influencers who usually steered clear of politics declared, "This is why showing up matters." The cultural wave was bigger than a hearing. It was an affirmation of values.
Meanwhile, Bannon's camp scrambled. His allies tried to spin the exchange as bias, claiming Crockett was grandstanding. But the images circulating online told a different story, one they couldn't control. His raised voice, his pointed finger, his visible frustration, all of it undercut his narrative of dominance. He hadn't looked untouchable, he had looked cornered. And that perception was devastating. Editorials poured in. One headline read, "Crockett exposes the emperor without clothes." Another declared, "The day arrogance met its match." Across op-eds, a theme emerged. Bannon had thrived for years on controlling narratives, but Crockett had shifted the script. She didn't just beat him in argument, she beat him in symbolism, in optics, in the raw theater of democracy. On the ground, supporters rallied. In Dallas, in Houston, in cities across the country, small gatherings formed spontaneously. People watching clips on big screens, cheering as if they were witnessing a championship fight. Hashtags weren't just trending, they were turning into slogans on handmade posters. And for Crockett, the moment was more than a personal victory. It was a validation of her journey, a signal to her supporters that their trust in her wasn't misplaced. She didn't just stand tall for herself, she stood tall for everyone who had ever felt dismissed, silenced, or underestimated. The aftershocks reached even those who had tried to ignore her before. Lawmakers whispered in hallways, reassessing the freshman congresswoman they had underestimated. Lobbyists who once brushed her off now worried about her growing influence. And Bannon himself? For all his bluster, he knew he had been rattled. His silence after the hearing spoke louder than his words during it. The ripple effect was undeniable. Crockett's moment became a movement, a symbol stitched into the broader tapestry of America's reckoning with truth and power. But as the nation celebrated her clapback, a deeper question lingered in the air. Beyond the memes, beyond the hashtags, what would this moment mean for the future of political courage? Because if one exchange could light a fire across the country, what might come next could ignite an inferno.
When the storm of reactions began to settle, one truth rose above the noise. Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Steve Bannon was never just about two individuals sparring in a hearing room. It was about what each represented and what America chose to see in their clash. On one side stood Bannon, a man who had built his image on manipulation, bluster, and division. His power wasn't rooted in service, but in spectacle, in convincing people that noise equaled strength and chaos equaled strategy. For years, that mask had held. For years, arrogance had passed itself off as influence. But in that moment, the mask cracked. Because on the other side stood Crockett, grounded not in performance, but in principle. Her calm composure, her steady persistence, her refusal to be shaken, all of it embodied a different kind of power. Not the power of wealth or status, but the power of dignity. The kind of power that comes from knowing who you serve and why you fight. Her story resonated because it was bigger than her. She became a stand-in for every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every worker who had been silenced, every student who had been underestimated. By holding her ground, she reminded the nation that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. And that's why people didn't just watch her, they saw themselves in her. They saw the America that still believes in fairness, in accountability, in the courage to look corruption in the eye and say, "Not today." The lesson of that day wasn't complicated. It was universal. Arrogance collapses under the weight of truth. Dignity, though quieter, endures. Crockett didn't defeat Bannon with louder words. She defeated him with stronger values. She showed that leadership isn't about who can dominate the room. It's about who can stand tall when the room tries to silence them. And that's the America people want to believe in. An America where justice isn't just a slogan, but a living principle. Where ordinary people can rise to extraordinary moments. where leaders earn respect not through intimidation, but through service. Her exchange with Bannon will be remembered not because of his outbursts, but because of her restraint. Not because of his arrogance, but because of her clarity. Not because of his bluster, but because of her truth. It's a reminder that power built on fear is temporary, but power built on dignity is lasting. That arrogance may dominate the headlines for a day, but courage defines the history books. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder for every viewer, every supporter, every citizen watching. You don't have to match the noise of your opponents. You only need to stand firm in your values. That's what Crockett modeled, and that's the moral that will echo long after the hearing is forgotten. But as the chamber quieted, as the news cycle spun, one final challenge remained. Would America carry this lesson forward or let it fade into another fleeting viral moment? The answer, as always, would depend not just on Crockett, but on all who were inspired by her stand. Because the story wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun.
The lesson of that day wasn't complicated. It was universal. Arrogance collapses under the weight of truth. Dignity, though quieter, endures. Crockett didn't defeat Bannon with louder words. She defeated him with stronger values. She showed that leadership isn't about who can dominate the room. It's about who can stand tall when the room tries to silence them. And that's the America people want to believe in. An America where justice isn't just a slogan, but a living principle. Where ordinary people can rise to extraordinary moments. Where leaders earn respect not through intimidation, but through service. Her exchange with Bannon will be remembered not because of his outbursts, but because of her restraint. Not because of his arrogance, but because of her clarity. Not because of his bluster, but because of her truth. It's a reminder that power built on fear is temporary, but power built on dignity is lasting. That arrogance may dominate the headlines for a day, but courage defines the history books. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder for every viewer, every supporter, every citizen watching. You don't have to match the noise of your opponents. You only need to stand firm in your values. That's what Crockett modeled, and that's the moral that will echo long after the hearing is forgotten. But as the chamber quieted, as the news cycle spun, one final challenge remained. Would America carry this lesson forward or let it fade into another fleeting viral moment? The answer, as always, would depend not just on Crockett, but on all who were inspired by her stand. Because the story wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Steve Bannon was more than a headline, more than a viral clip. It was a reminder, etched in front of millions, that truth can still pierce through arrogance, and that dignity, when wielded with conviction, is unshakable. Crockett didn't just defend herself in that hearing. She defended the very idea that public service belongs to the people, not the powerful. She showed that a calm voice can silence a roar, that preparation can dismantle bluster, and that courage rooted in values will always outlast arrogance rooted in ego. But this story doesn't end in the committee room. Its real power lies in how we carry it forward. Every viewer who shared the clip, every student who replayed her words, every worker who saw themselves reflected in her defiance, you are part of this movement. Because Crockett's victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to all who believe that America can still live up to its promise. A nation where truth is louder than lies and where dignity stands taller than corruption. So as we close this chapter, let it not be the end, but the spark. Share this story, tell it again. Pass it to someone who needs to remember that arrogance is never invincible and that courage, quiet, steady, rooted in service, can still win. Subscribe, stay connected, and add your voice to this growing movement. Because the fight for justice isn't just happening in hearings or headlines. It's happening every day, in every community, wherever people stand tall against arrogance and choose dignity instead. And as Jasmine Crockett proved, when you choose dignity, history remembers.